The sound that defines the Roman arena is not the clash of steel, nor the roar of a lion. It is the sound of 80,000 human voices, a single, thunderous entity, rising and falling with the tide of blood below. It is a roar of anticipation as the condemned are led out onto the hot sand, a gasp of collective shock as the beasts are released, and a final, deafening acclamation of approval as a life is extinguished for their pleasure. The air, thick with the smell of sweat, wine, dust, and something coppery and sweet, is the very atmosphere of a civilization amusing itself to death. We are told by the poet Juvenal that the Roman people, having long ago surrendered their political power, cared only for two things: panem et circenses, bread and circuses. But this cynical observation, so often quoted, sanitizes a horrifying truth. It was not merely circuses they craved. It was a theater of cruelty, a meticulously choreographed spectacle of judicial murder where the line between justice and entertainment was not blurred, but erased entirely. What truly happened in the shadow of the Colosseum and in arenas across the empire? What does it tell us about a people and about power itself when the most profound act of the state, the taking of a human life, becomes the premier form of popular diversion? To understand this brutal pageantry, we must first understand the city it was designed to control. Rome in the imperial age was a metropolis of unprecedented scale, a sprawling, chaotic organism of more than 1 million souls. It was a city of extreme contrasts, of marble temples and squalid, flammable tenements, of unimaginable wealth and desperate poverty. For the vast majority of its inhabitants, life was precarious. Work was scarce, disease was rampant, and the threat of hunger was a constant companion. This teeming, restless mass of humanity was a source of perpetual anxiety for the emperor. A riot over the grain supply, a protest that spiraled out of control, could threaten the stability of the entire regime. The emperor, therefore, had to engage in a constant and delicate dance of control. He was the city's benefactor, the one who guaranteed the grain dole, the panem. But he was also its master, the absolute authority who held the power of life and death in his hands. The circuses were the ultimate expression of this authority. They were a gift to the people, a distraction from their grim realities, but they were also a terrifying demonstration of what happened to those who defied Roman power. The legal framework of Rome itself was built upon a foundation of inequality, a concept alien to modern notions of justice, but central to the Roman worldview. Society was starkly divided into two classes: the honestiores, the more honorable people, and the humiliores, the lower people. The honestiores were the senators, the equestrians, the wealthy landowners, and high-ranking officials. If convicted of a capital crime, they were typically granted a swift and relatively dignified death, usually by beheading with a sword. It was a private affair, meant to preserve the honor of their family and class. The humiliores, however, the laborers, the artisans, the poor, the slaves, the foreigners, were subject to a different form of justice entirely. Their punishments were designed to be as painful, as humiliating, and as public as possible. This was summa supplicia, the extreme penalties, and it was this category of punishment that fed the insatiable appetite of the arena. This legal distinction was not merely a matter of practice. It was a codified principle that declared, by law, that the suffering of a poor man was a public commodity, while the life of a rich man was a private matter. Before the grand arenas dominated the landscape, Roman punishment had been a more straightforward, if still brutal, affair. Crucifixion, the punishment that would become infamous through its use against Jesus of Nazareth, existed long before the Colosseum. It was not a punishment for Roman citizens, but a terror reserved for the lowest of the low, rebellious slaves, pirates, and seditious provincials. Its origins lay in its sheer, calculated cruelty. It was a death designed to be slow, agonizing, and public. The process began not at the cross, but with a brutal scourging, the verberatio, where a whip embedded with bone and metal would tear the flesh from the victim's back. Already weakened and bleeding, The condemned was then forced to carry the heavy crossbeam, the patibulum, through the streets to the place of execution. It was a parade of shame, a final humiliation before the physical torment began. The mechanics of crucifixion were a masterpiece of prolonged agony. The victim was either nailed or tied to the wood, nails driven through the wrists, not the palms, which could not support the body's weight, would sever the median nerve, sending searing bolts of pain up the arms. The feet were nailed together to the upright post. Once hoisted into place, the true torture began. It was not a death of bleeding, but of slow, agonizing asphyxiation. To breathe, the victim had to push up on the nails in their feet to relieve the pressure on their chest muscles and diaphragm. Each breath was a choice, an excruciating effort purchased with a fresh wave of pain from their torn wrists and feet. Exhaustion, dehydration, and shock would eventually set in. The body would sag, the ability to push up would fail, and the victim would suffocate, unable to draw air into their collapsing lungs. It could take hours, sometimes days. And all the while, they were exposed to the elements, the jeers of passers-by, and the scavenging birds. The message was unmistakable. This is the fate of those who defy the order of Rome. When Spartacus's slave revolt was crushed in 71 BCE, 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Appian Way, a 200-kilometer avenue of dying men, a stark and silent warning to any who would dare dream of freedom. Yet, as the Republic gave way to the empire, a new form of spectacle began to take shape. The raw, static horror of crucifixion was not enough for a populace that craved dynamic entertainment. A new punishment entered the legal and theatrical repertoire: damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This was considered the ultimate degradation. To be killed by a wild animal was to be denied a human death, to be reduced to mere meat, your body torn apart for the amusement of a crowd. It was a fate reserved for the most despised criminals: murderers, deserters from the army, runaway slaves, and, most famously, the early Christians whose refusal to worship the Roman gods was seen as an act of treasonous atheism. The sheer logistics of this punishment reveal the industrial scale of Roman cruelty. The empire was scoured for exotic and fearsome creatures. Lions were brought from North Africa, bears from Caledonia, leopard from Syria, and tigers from Parthia. A vast network of hunters, trappers, and merchants existed solely to supply the arenas with these instruments of death. The execution itself was a carefully staged performance. The meridiani, the midday executions, were often seen as the low point of the day's entertainment, a filler between the morning animal hunts and the afternoon gladiatorial combats. Yet even this boring segment was laced with a dark, theatrical creativity. The condemned, known as bestiarii, were often stripped naked to heighten their vulnerability and shame. Sometimes they were tied to stakes, helpless before the attack. In other instances, they were given crude weapons and forced to fight the animals in a hopeless parody of the skilled venators, the professional beast hunters. The crowd would roar with laughter and excitement as a clumsy, terrified man was mauled by a bear or chased down by a pack of wolves. The Roman imagination, however, could be even more perverse. Condemned criminals were sometimes forced to reenact scenes from mythology, a form of fatal charade. A man might be dressed as the mythological hero Prometheus and chained to a rock, where a trained eagle would be released to tear at his liver. A woman might be forced to play the part of Dirce, tied to the horns of a raging bull. In these moments, the state was not just executing a criminal. It was weaving their death into the fabric of Roman culture, transforming a judicial act into a live-action myth, a story told in flesh and blood. Perhaps the most visceral of all the summa supplicia was vivicemburium, death by burning. This punishment carried a powerful symbolic weight, often reserved for those who had committed crimes of fire, like arson, in a grimly literal application of justice. But its most notorious use was against those deemed enemies of the state and its religious order. The historian Tacitus provides a chilling account of how the Emperor Nero, seeking a scapegoat for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, targeted the city's small Christian community. He accused them of hatred against mankind and subjected them to punishments of exquisite cruelty. Tacitus writes, "Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination. When daylight had expired, Nero," he tells us, even offered his own gardens for the spectacle, mingling with the crowd dressed as a charioteer. Here, the human body was transformed into a tool, a living torch, its agony providing light for an emperor's party. The horror lies not just in the act itself, but in its context, the casual blending of state-sanctioned torture with private entertainment. Other methods displayed a similar flair for symbolic cruelty. The punishment for parricide, the murder of one's own father, was uniquely macabre. The convicted, known as a parricida, was first scourged, then sewn into a leather sack, the culleus, along with a collection of live animals, a dog, a rooster, a viper, and an ape. The sack was then thrown into the sea or a river. The logic was that a man who had committed such an unnatural crime should not be allowed to touch the earth, breathe the air, or see the sky in his final moments. He was to die in a chaotic frenzy, suffocated and torn apart by panicked animals in the dark, a microcosm of the primordial chaos he had unleashed upon his own family. For traitors, or those who gave false testimony, there was the Tarpeian Rock, a steep cliff on the southern summit of the Capitoline Hill. The condemned was simply hurled from the top, their body dashed on the rocks below. It was a swift, brutal, and highly visible end, a clear message from the heart of Roman power. The construction of the Flavian Amphitheater, known to posterity as the Colosseum, marked the apex of this culture of spectacle. Inaugurated in 80 CE under the Emperor Titus, it was an engineering marvel, a testament to Roman ingenuity and power. Capable of holding up to 80,000 spectators, it was a city in miniature with a strict seating hierarchy that mirrored the social strata of Rome itself. The emperor and the Vestal virgins had their boxes, the senators sat on marble tiers at the front, and the common people and women were relegated to the highest wooden seats. But the true genius of the Colosseum lay beneath the sand-covered floor of the arena. The hypogeum was a two-story, subterranean network of tunnels, cells, and passageways. Here, gladiators waited for their turn to fight. Condemned prisoners languished in darkness, and caged animals paced in a frenzy, starved and agitated to ensure their ferocity. An elaborate system of elevators and trapdoors allowed for dramatic entrances, with beasts or fighters appearing as if from nowhere, adding to the theatrical surprise. A day at the Games was a full-day affair, a meticulously structured program of escalating violence. The morning, the Venetians, featured skilled hunters pitting themselves against wild animals, or different species of animals being forced to fight each other. These were bloody, but were primarily displays of skill and the exotic reach of the empire. Then came the midday lull, the meridiani, the executions. This was when the humiliors met their fate. To the Roman audience, this was often the least exciting part of the day. The philosopher Seneca the Younger, a Stoic who found the games morally repugnant, attended the midday spectacle once and was left utterly horrified by the casual cruelty of the crowd. He wrote, "By chance I attended a midday exhibition, expecting some fun, wit, and relaxation. But it was quite the contrary. Now all the trifling is put aside, and it is pure murder. The men have no defensive armor. They are exposed to blows at all points, and no one ever strikes in vain." He describes a crowd chanting, "Kill him, flog him, burn him. Why does he run so timidly? Why does he not die more willingly?" Seneca saw the truth that others ignored, that the spectacle was not just killing the condemned, it was poisoning the souls of the spectators. The afternoon was reserved for the main event, the gladiatorial contests. These were not typically executions, as gladiators were valuable assets, highly trained athletes who often became popular heroes. They were slaves, prisoners of war, or volunteers who fought for the chance of fame, fortune, and eventual freedom. Their combat was governed by rules and refereed, a martial ballet of skill and courage. Yet, death was always a possibility. When a gladiator was defeated and wounded, his fate rested in the hands of the crowd and, ultimately, the emperor or the magistrate presiding over the games. The crowd would scream and wave their handkerchiefs, and the president of the games would deliver the verdict, reputedly with a gesture of the thumb, the pollice verso. The exact nature of this gesture is debated by historians, but its meaning was absolute. A signal for mercy might allow the gladiator to live and fight another day. A signal for death meant the victor had to deliver the final, killing blow. In this moment, the entire audience became complicit in the act of killing. Their roar was a death sentence. Their collective will made manifest by the blade of sword. The games were thus a powerful political tool, a constant dialogue of power between the ruler and the ruled, acted out over the body of a fallen fighter. Section